My name is Eric Smith. I'm with GridSME. I'm the Director of NERC Compliance Services here. And we wanted to talk a little bit about the confluence of the Executive Order 13920 and the current enforcement of SIP 13 and where they come together, the confusion that's ensued as a result of it, and how they are actually going to work together and end up being one as we go forward. Okay, so now that NERC SIP 13 Supply Chain Management Standard has become enforceable and the Executive Order 13920 has been signed into effect, we're sort of waiting, and we're still waiting to see guidance on how it will be enforced. Then I'd take some time to look at how the two are converging over the next few months. So as anyone who's keenly aware of the NERC SIP standards, NERC SIP 13 is the newest SIP standard. It addresses supply chain risk management, more specifically cybersecurity in the supply chain. An additional note is that the standard is only applicable as it's currently written to those entities that are medium and high impact from a SIP rating perspective. That said, the low impact version is currently in the hands of the drafting team at this very moment and is due to be voted on by industry and headed to the NERC Board of Directors by late fall of 2021. The Executive Order 13920, securing the United States bulk electric system, otherwise known as the EO or the Executive Order, was signed into effect May 1st, 2020. And it's applicable to all transmission equipment operating at 69 kV and above, excluding any local distribution equipment. Most of the components included in generation sites, substations, and switchyards are all included in that executive order. Of note here is that the Department of Energy was tasked with developing guidance for industry on the implementation of this order. It was due to be distributed to industry by October 1st, 2020. However, as the taping of this segment, it is yet to be released and we're waiting to hear word on that. We've been told that sometime later this year. So the key point of this executive order is that it prohibits the transaction of any components of the facilities listed above to come from an adversarial country. So this means that the company that manufactures the component or the supplier of those components or the broker of the deal or the installer of the components can't be associated with an adversarial country in any way, shape, or form, whether they be located there, from there, have relations with them, whatever it might be. So, of note here is that the Department of Energy has defined the adversarial countries loosely, not officially, as currently being China, Russia, Iran, South Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. And the executive order goes on to provide that the Department of Energy should create a criteria for recognizing particular equipment and vendors, quote unquote. That's really important here, that phrase, criteria for recognizing particular equipment and particular vendors. This means that the DOE should create a white list of vendors within industry. So, how does this relate to SIP 13, you ask? That's a very good question. The most obvious answer is that they both have to do with supply chain. But upon closer inspection, we can see that there's a pretty clear tie between them. SIP 13 R1 states that an entity must have a plan to mitigate supply risks. It states that the plan must include, and I quote here from SIP 13 R1.1, quote, one or more processes used in planning for the procurement of the BES cyber systems to identify and assess cybersecurity risks to the bulk electric system from vendor products or services resulting from 1, procuring and installing vendor equipment and software, and 2, transitions from one vendor to another vendor. I read that specifically to quote it directly from the standard. That phrase, procuring and installing vendor equipment and software, is where the executive order is shedding some till now unseen detail. It's been left up to the entities to determine what that means. Up until now, the process for that planning and procurement was not focused on the country the equipment comes from. Rather, it's been left unprescribed in most of the guidance given to industry. So the executive order also provides for use of existing industry frameworks to provide some structure to industry in terms of how to implement the executive order. The most obvious one for the utility industry is, of course, SIP 13. If I had a crystal ball, I'm sure that I would see the DOE drafting a notice to instruct FERC to develop guidelines for industry to use the whitelist that DOE develops for procuring BPS components. And that FERC would then post a notice to NERC to draft the revision to SIP 13 and the low impact version in SIP 3 that's coming out soon, to include a sub-item to R1.1 that the procurement of certain components of the BPS come from the whitelist provided by DOE. But wait, I see storm clouds in my crystal ball. The issue here is with the idea of the whitelist. NERC and the various standards drafting teams to date have taken exception with the idea of providing whitelists to industry on a variety of topics. Everything from which type of firewalls or network architecture to use to which preventive maintenance or vegetation maintenance vendors to use or styles to use. The idea of having a narrow list of vendors to choose from in an industry where innovation is moving quicker than the bureaucrats can maintain them is a recipe for disaster. So, a much more effective measure would be to provide prescriptive guidance for assessing manufacturers, suppliers, or installers and or the products to be procured. This would allow owners and developers to choose any of the newest competitors in a market and still be able to ensure that the products and services of any of the subcomponents are not coming from an adversarial country. So SIP 13 is already in enforcement for high and medium impact things. Right? So just low impact folks are going to have to contend with the new supply chain risk management standard that will be part of the SIP 3 low impact requirements that will be probably out next year. When that does come out, what is that going to mean for low impact? Well, that's going to be a huge lift for low impact, just like the transient cyber assets and removable media was for low impact to deal with this year. It'll be a whole other huge lift of developing supply chain risk management policies and procedures involving procurement departments, legal department contracts, whoever negotiates those. Secondly, it will involve new rules for your firewall or new things in your electronic access controls plan for managing vendor remote access, which is slightly different than interactive remote access that we currently know now, which is your employees are able to access through a VPN and then through a jump post and get to your best cyber assets. Vendors having that ability to get to it now are going to be characterized in a slightly different way, most of which it will include things like a WebEx session where you share the desktop. The vendor on the other end now has the ability to take control of the desktop during that session to provide support or to take control and drive for a moment to show you some cool stuff. That all now has to be managed and regulated by the entity also under the new supply chain risk management guidelines. So those will all be part of the heavy lift that will be on those low impact entities that have to put in the supply chain risk management program. And it likely will include some type of assessment or some type of understanding where the equipment is coming from in any new transactions that occur. Yeah, so anytime that there is a equipment to be purchased, services to be purchased, contracts renegotiated, changing of vendors, anything like that constitutes a new contract, and it stipulates that you have to go back to your SIP 13 plan and make sure that you follow all the steps in the plan to ensure that those vendors in that procurement process are actually following the guidelines. Two things we can do. One is help entities build that supply chain risk management program for the low impact entities, providing policies, procedures, documentation, looking at current policies and processes that are within the entities and making sure that they meet the requirements. Two, we can also perform assessments of those projects and do some of that assessment on an ongoing basis for those projects as an outsourced vendor. And they can then use that to say, okay, we followed, as part of our procedure, we retain someone like GridSME to do an assessment of the vendor, the products, the services, everything to ensure that they meet the guidelines of the executive order, meet the cybersecurity requirements of CIP 13, and ensure that they are meeting the requirements of our electronic security controls program, ours being the entity themselves. So the executive order very explicitly states that it only applies to any transactions, and this is kind of a key phrase there. It's not when the project goes into energization or COD or registration. It's when the transaction is enacted. So if you have a new project starting up and it's not set to go to COD until November 2020 or June of 2021, but all the transactions took place in 2019 to purchase GSU transformers, wind turbines, whatever it might be, that have a long manufacturer tail, those transactions that took place in 2019 are exempt because it clearly states that it is any transaction that occurs after May 1st, 2020. And from there, it's any project that has any transition connection of 69 kV or higher except for local distribution. So if you're a generating facility, transmission facility that operates at 69 kV or above, and you're purchasing any new products, services, or contracts, then it's applicable. So keep your eyes and ears tuned here for more information as it becomes available on this developing topic.